Welcome to Darkverse, the place where the line between reality and the macabre blurs, and every shadow hides a story. I'm your host, Isaac Nightshade, your guide through the darkest corners of the human mind. As a lifelong fan of Breaking Bad and a storyteller of the eerie and unsettling, I've always found myself drawn to the way the show taps into the darker aspects of the human psyche, exploring transformation, corruption, and what lies beyond the surface. But last night was different. I had a dream, a nightmare, really. And when I woke up, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had experienced was more than just a random, twisted sequence of images. It felt real. It felt like I had crossed into a world that wasn't just a creation of my subconscious, but something more alive. The dream was a version of Breaking Bad, but with a darker, more sinister twist. One that took me beyond the chemistry and the power plays, straight into a place where the boundaries of reality and the supernatural had vanished. Something had crossed over. Something that had always been waiting. And now I can't help but feel like that dream isn't finished yet. So tonight, let me take you through it. Let me tell you about what I saw, what I felt, and what it means. This story isn't just about Walter White or Heisenberg, it's about something else. Something much darker. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into this twisted tale together. Welcome to Darkverse. Welcome to the nightmare I can't escape. It's strange how quiet everything becomes when you're told you won't make it to your next birthday. The hospital room hummed like a fridge left too long in the dark. The doctor's lips moved, but his words blurred into something meaningless. Something heavy. Stage 3. Inoperable. Prognosis grim. I nodded, because that's what a rational man does. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out into the sterile white hallway like I had simply finished a parent-teacher conference. But inside, something had gone utterly still, like the air in my lungs had thickened to tar. When I got home, Skylar wasn't there. Thank God. I didn't want to see that look in her eyes again. The one that meant she was trying to be strong for me while calculating childcare costs and funeral arrangements behind her silence. Instead, I found myself in the garage. I didn't plan to go there. My body moved without me like sleepwalking. Dust choked the air. Old tools, boxes, forgotten projects, the bones of another man's life. A younger me. It was quiet except for the distant barking of a dog somewhere down the block. The kind of suburban background noise you stop hearing until the silence becomes louder than sound. I found my old notebooks under a cracked plastic bin labeled Class Notes, 89. Most were filled with yellowing pages of chemical equations and lesson plans, basic stuff, redox reactions, polymer chains, notes from a better time, notes from before the rot started growing in my chest. But then there was the one I didn't recognize. It was bound in leather, not a spiral notebook, but something older, heavier. The kind of book you'd find in an antique shop, locked in a case behind dusty glass. I must have stared at it for 5 minutes before opening it, trying to remember where it had come from. There were no markings on the cover, not even a name inside, but it felt familiar. When I opened it, the air shifted. Just a little, like the pressure changed in the garage. A subtle tug, like someone had opened a window that wasn't there. The pages inside weren't blank, but they weren't quite legible either. Chemical notations, scrawled, and chaotic. Diagrams, sigils, formulas drawn in such delicate lines they looked etched into the paper. Some of it resembled advanced organic chemistry, but the symbols intertwined with others I didn't recognize. Things that weren't scientific at all. They curved like calligraphy, some jagged, sharp, like writing made to cut the eyes that read it. And then there it was, written near the center fold in what looked like dried blood, or ink that had darkened with age. I couldn't tell. One phrase, Heisenberg is the gate. I felt it the moment I read it, a kind of lurch deep in my chest, like my body recognized something my mind had not caught up to yet. My pulse slowed. The lights flickered. I closed the book quickly, almost dropped it. The silence was deafening. My ears rang like I had just left a concert. But I hadn't moved an inch. The hum of the fluorescent light above was gone. The dog had stopped barking. There was only the sound of my breath. Shallow, ragged, like I'd run a mile and couldn't catch it. That phrase pulsed in my head like a migraine. Heisenberg is the gate, not a person, not just a name, a threshold, a way in or out. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the notebook on the kitchen table, watched it like it might crawl away when I wasn't looking. Every so often I'd flip it open and try to decipher the scribbles. There were chemical formulas. Yes, but wrong, or maybe beyond wrong. One was labeled C6H13NO3 par d'Alassay, but the "she" was scratched out with dozens of overlapping slashes. Underneath it, in smaller writing, "Purity unlocks." By morning the phrase had settled into my bones. It became something more than just curiosity. It felt necessary, like a hunger, like I was remembering something I had once known but buried. The same way you forget a dream when you wake, only to have it echo hours later in flashes and smells. The next day, I returned to the book. I flipped to the back. A small folded piece of paper was tucked into the seam, faded, brittle. It wasn't blank. There were numbers, proportions, temperature values, a cooking method. But again, something was off. It wasn't just methamphetamine production. I'd taught chemistry for decades. This was different. It was as if someone had taken the basic principles of synthesis and fused them with something else, something older, alchemical, philosophical, ritualistic. The ingredients weren't standard. One line read, "base salt from living vapor." Another said, "metal touched by decay." The final line was the most disturbing. "Blood of origin." I told myself it was nonsense, some junkie's notebook that got mixed in with my own things by accident, a prop for some art project. But then why did my handwriting appear in the margins? Notes written in shorthand I used in college, equations that had my rhythm, my abbreviations. Why did it feel like I had written it in another life? Later that afternoon I found myself in the garage again, notebook in hand. I didn't even notice I had walked there. I took out my old lab kit. Most of it was rusted, or dried out. But a few pieces were still intact. Beakers, flasks, burners. I laid them out on the workbench like sacred objects. I started cleaning, preparing, measuring. Not because I wanted to, but because my hands moved on their own, like muscle memory from a life I didn't remember living. I lit the burner. The flame hissed, but it wasn't yellow or orange, like it should have been. It was blue, a deep, unnatural blue. Not just bright, it shimmered, almost crystalline, like the edge of frost, catching sunlight in the wrong part of the sky. It bent slightly, like it wanted to pull itself inward. The heat didn't radiate like normal. Instead, it drew everything toward it. Heat, light, sound, even the silence felt sharper. The flame danced, but it didn't flicker. It watched. I leaned in without realizing, eyes reflecting the impossible flame. Something inside me moved, twitched, woke up. I felt my heart slow, not in panic, but in understanding. There was something beyond death, beyond the diagnosis, a path through the fire. And somehow this wasn't the end of me, this was the beginning. I didn't sleep the night I found the formula. It stayed with me, humming silently beneath my skin. I could feel it like a second heartbeat, pulsing in time with my own, though just slightly out of sync, like it was waiting to fall into rhythm, to take over once it matched. I kept the notebook open on the kitchen table, as I drank cup after cup of lukewarm coffee. My eyes burned, but I couldn't look away from the page. Synthesis, Beyond Control. The title alone stirred something in me, a whisper in the back of my mind that said, "This was always yours." The formula spanned the page like a creeping vine, sprawling across the margins, in ink that shimmered ever so faintly under the overhead light. Some parts were immediately recognizable, basic hydrocarbon structures, thermodynamic calculations, but woven between them were sigils, not just scientific symbols, but things that felt older, pre-chemical, pre-mathematical, pre-human. I stared at one for too long, a jagged triangle inside a spiral, ringed by dots that didn't follow any logical pattern. I reached out without thinking, like my hand was moving on instinct, and traced it with my fingertip. The paper warmed, not in the way something heats from touch, but as if it were breathing, responding, like a hand clasping mine through the paper. My skin prickled. A sharp sting bloomed behind my eyes. Then the blood came. At first I thought it was a nosebleed, but it wasn't that kind of flow. It didn't drip or run. It seeped, thick and slow,
like molasses, darker than it should have been, nearly black in the light, trailing down my upper lip with an unnatural viscosity. I rushed to the sink, but even as I leaned forward, something in me didn't want to wipe it away. Something wanted it there. Eventually the bleeding stopped, my heart slowed, but I didn't go to the hospital, didn't call anyone. The logical part of my mind tried to sound the alarm, warn me that something was wrong, deeply wrong, but it was muffled, dulled, like it was trying to scream underwater. Instead, I returned to the notebook, and I kept reading. Every night for a week, I studied it like scripture. I took notes, cross-referenced what I could with actual chemistry textbooks, but the farther I went into it, the more it became clear. This wasn't meant to be understood, not in the traditional sense. It spoke more than it taught. It bled meaning through suggestion, through inference. Like poetry made from atoms, certain terms began appearing repeatedly. Like coded instructions, catalyst must witness, heat through sacrifice, base of bone, vapor of memory, salt of flesh. It didn't make sense, but somehow I knew what it meant, deep down in the hollow of my ribs. My body remembered it the way you remember how to breathe. I couldn't stop myself. It wasn't obsession, it was evolution. Like the cancer had unlocked something, some door inside me that had been sealed my entire life, waiting for the right key, or the right sentence. The formulas shifted every time I looked at them. I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean literally. I would write them down, leave the room, come back, and something would be different. The shape of the molecules, the position of the sigils. Once the entire page was blank, except for one word in the center, cook. The next morning I went to the supply store, told Skylar I was restocking my lab supplies for a tutoring side gig. She barely looked up from the laundry. I bought everything I needed, not just for meth, but for this other thing, this synthesis. Some of the ingredients were hard to find, some weren't even labeled. One vial was filled with a gray powder that gave off a bitter metallic smell. Another held what looked like charred hair suspended in a thick, amber gel. The man who sold it to me didn't ask questions, just smiled with cracked lips, and said, "Be careful what you wake up." I didn't ask what he meant. That night I set up in the garage. I cleaned off the old workbench, lined the burners, measured out the components with hands that shook too little. I was calm, focused, the same way I felt back when I first fell in love with chemistry. Only now, the stakes were different. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about death. It was about crossing a threshold. I lit the flame, blew again, but this time it hissed louder, not like a leak but like language. I could almost make out words in the sizzle. The air thickened. The overhead light dimmed, not flickered, just dimmed, like something in the room was consuming the brightness, absorbing it, pulling it inward. One by one I added the ingredients in the order the formula dictated, not the chemical formula but the one written in that other language, the language that vibrated behind the eyes, that made my teeth itch just reading it. A fog rose from the beaker, thin, silver, coiling like fingers. The smell hit me: copper, singed sugar, and something sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. I covered my mouth with a sleeve, but it was too late. The vapor was already in me. My head swam, my vision doubled, then tripled, then it wasn't vision at all. The garage folded, bent inward, the walls began to breathe, slowly expanding and contracting like lungs. The wooden shelves moaned. My reflection in the glass flask smiled. Even though I wasn't, I took a step back, but the floor caught my feet like mud. My ears rang, nose sang, a low droning hum, like the world had been turned into a tuning fork. And beneath it, buried in the frequency, a voice whispered, "You are the threshold." I collapsed. I don't remember falling, just the sensation of being held, lifted, somehow, and cradled in something impossibly warm, not comforting, hungry, like the air was wrapping around me, studying me, seeing if I was ready, seeing if I was complete. When I came to, it was morning. The flame was out, the beaker empty, the formula gone from the notebook, replaced with a single sentence. "One step remains." I checked my arm. My veins glowed faintly beneath the skin, like they'd been injected with something bioluminescent, just enough to notice, just enough to make me wonder if I was still me. The worst part, I felt better, stronger. My breathing wasn't as labored. The ache in my chest had dulled to a whisper. For the first time in months I wasn't dying. but I don't think I'm living either. And somehow I know the formula is just the beginning, not a cure, not even a creation. It's an invitation to what I don't yet know, but it's waiting, and I've already said yes. I waited 3 days before going to Jesse. I told myself it was strategy, caution, patience, but the truth is, I wasn't sure he could handle what this had become. Not anymore. When I found him, he was holed up in that same ratty little duplex he never really cleaned. TV flickering static, ashtray overflowing, blinds permanently half closed to keep the day out. He looked older, somehow, not in his face, but in his posture, like life had draped something heavy over his shoulders, and he didn't have the energy to take it off. Walt, he blinked like I was a hallucination. Thought you were, I don't know, off dying or something. I didn't smile, not yet. He sat up straight. There was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, but it came with weariness too, that guardedness he always carried when I knocked on his door out of the blue. I showed him the vial, just a pinch of the new batch I had synthesized. Crystalline blue, glowing faintly under the dim light, more vibrant than anything we'd ever made before, almost alive. It shimmered in his palm like frost catching moonlight. Holy shit, he whispered. What is this? I told him it was the future. I told him we could cook again, go bigger than before. No competition, no impurities, no flaw. He asked me what it was made of. I didn't lie. I just said, the truth would hurt you. He laughed at that, uneasy, but I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was already imagining what it would be like. The cash, the rush, the control, and he didn't want to go back to selling garbage for wannabe dealers who didn't know a pipette from a pipe bomb. So he agreed. We took the RV out that night. The air out in the desert was different now, or maybe I was. I could feel it pressing against my skin, like static, like anticipation. The wind whispered as we drove, faint, melodic pulses that almost formed words. I pretended not to hear them. Jesse never mentioned them, but I know he heard something too. He kept rubbing the back of his neck, like there was an itch under his skin he couldn't quite Inside the RV, everything felt off. The windows steamed from the inside. The lights flickered even though I'd replaced the bulbs. The metal counters were cold to the touch, colder than they should have been, like they were exhaling something not meant for lungs. I set up the equipment. Jesse hovered by the door, nervous, looking at the cooler I'd brought with the ingredients. He didn't ask again what was inside. We started cooking. At first, it was like old times, the familiar rhythm, stir, heat, distill. Only this time, I didn't follow the traditional step. I followed the formula, synthesis, beyond control. The notations had etched themselves into my memory like scars. My hands knew what to do before my brain did. Jesse noticed the changes, the angles of the glassware, the slow, deliberate timing, the ingredients that didn't look like anything he'd seen in a lab. Where'd you even get this stuff? He asked, watching me pour a pale shimmering liquid into the distiller. It hissed on contact, curling with a strange pink vapor. I didn't answer. The RV filled with a smell I can barely describe. Sweet, metallic, earthy, like burning soil mixed with sugar. It clawed down the throat. Jesse gagged. Jesus, Walt, is that safe? Just keep the vent on. But even with the fan running, the vapors grew thick, heavy. They didn't rise like steam. They lingered, swirling low, almost crawling. Jesse backed up toward the door, one hand against the wall, the other trying to wave the fog away. Then he dropped. It wasn't slow. 1 second he was standing, coughing, and the next his knees gave out and he crumpled like a marionette, with its strings cut. I rushed to him. His eyes were open, rolled up into his skull, lips twitching with words I couldn't hear. Jesse. He didn't respond. The room felt too quiet all of a sudden, not silent, vacant, like everything alive had stepped out for a moment, leaving only the shell of reality behind. I pressed my fingers to Jesse's neck. Faint pulse, shallow breath, still alive, but his mouth kept moving. Whispers, soft, frantic, like he was trapped in a conversation or a prayer. I leaned in, straining to hear. My skin prickled. He was speaking in a language I didn't know. It wasn't gibberish. It had structure, rhythm, a chant. No, not quite, but deliberate, as if reciting something taught. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. He inhaled so sharply it sounded like a scream stuck in reverse. He jerked upright, gasping, looking around like he'd just escaped a fire. Then he saw me, backed away. I saw it, he whispered. What? His eyes locked on mine, wide, wet, terrified. I saw something, but it wasn't my dream. Man, he pressed his hands to his head. It was like I was in something huge, like a hive. No windows, just this humming, like a giant was breathing through 1,000 mouths. And there were things in the walls, moving, crawling, watching, but they weren't looking at me. They were looking through me. I swallowed. Did they speak? He shook his head. No, worse. They were waiting. A silence stretched between us, thick as the fog still clinging to the RV walls. Jesse didn't ask to leave. He just opened the door, stepped out and vomited into the sand. I stayed inside, staring at the batch still cooking on the flame. The crystals were forming, perfect, pristine, blue so vibrant it shimmered like oil, but there was a shape inside them, not a shadow, not a reflection, a form, curl, waiting. I didn't stop the cook. I let the synthesis finish, packaged the crystals, stored them in the black case I brought just for this. Jesse sat silently in the passenger seat on the drive back, twitching every time he saw something out the window that wasn't there. When I dropped him off, he turned to me. We're not making that again. I didn't argue. He went inside. I sat in the RV for a while, watching the sky. Something about the stars seemed wrong, like they were closer than usual, like they were watching too. I turned on the radio, all stat except for one burst of sound, just 3 seconds long. A whisper, he dreamed well, and then silence. There's something wrong with the flame. It was the third cook. Jesse wasn't there. After what happened in the RV, the dream, the chanting, the fog, he hadn't answered my calls. I don't blame him. Whatever he saw, it had marked him. I could see it in the way he moved, how he flinched at corners, how he stopped sleeping in his bedroom and started crashing on his couch. All the lights on. I could have waited. Maybe I should have, but the formula was still unfolding. Every night, the notebook changed. Slight differences at first. A dot where there hadn't been one before. A line in an equation that curved instead of slanted. The synthesis was correcting itself, refining itself. It didn't need me to improve it. It needed me to follow it. And I was starting to believe, no, understand, that I wasn't the creator of anything. I was just the vessel, the hands, the gate. So I cooked. I moved the setup to the basement, somewhere more isolated. The RV felt too exposed now, too alive. The last time I'd stepped inside, the door had creaked open on its own. Even though I'd locked it tight, the air in there smelled like something crawling through old pipes, something wet. So I stripped down what I needed, moved it piece by piece, below the house, into the hollow dark beneath the foundation. Skylar never came down here. Holly wouldn't even go near the door. Good, they shouldn't be close to this. The burner clicked once, twice, then caught. The flame bloomed blue, not just any blue, a deep, oceanic color. So dark it bordered on black, that the edges, but with a pulsing core, like a sapphire heart beating in slow rhythm. And it didn't rise. It folded in, curling into itself like smoke in reverse. It wasn't casting light. It was absorbing it. The shadows around the room thickened. The edges of my vision blurred. But I didn't look away. I should have, because in the heart of that flame, I saw something. A shape, a curve, where there should have been chaos. A faint gleam of ivory, teeth, too many teeth, and eyes, open wide as if surprised to be seen, or pleased. It was smiling at me. I blinked. The image was gone, but the feeling wasn't. My skin crawled like it was being watched from the inside out. I checked the walls. Nothing, just cracked concrete, and silence. Still, I worked faster, not out of fear, but reverence. The formula demanded obedience, and I was beginning to realize it knew when I hesitated. I measured the catalyst, the powder gray, with a shimmer that never settled. One breath of it, and my nose started to run again, thick and warm. I ignored it, dropped it into the mixture. The liquid turned dark immediately, bubbling with a low hiss, like a whisper, passed between two lips, just inches apart. The smell came next, not unpleasant, familiar, even. The scent of scorched wood and iron, like the inside of an old furnace. But with it came another scent, subtle, sweet, decay. I stared as the beaker vibrated, slowly at first, then faster. A single crack formed along its base, spider webbing up toward the lip. I reached for the tongs to move it, but I was too late. The glass exploded with a sharp ringing pop. Shards flew across the bench. I turned my head, felt one nick my cheek, drawing a hot line of blood. But what caught my attention wasn't the glass, it was the liquid. It didn't spill, it moved, it slithered, not in the way syrup might drip, or oil might run. No, this thing slid, coiled, twitched like it had muscles. It crawled off the shattered remains of the beaker, and onto the steel tray below, pausing once, as if listening for direction. Then it moved toward the drain in the floor. I stood frozen. The overhead light buzzed. For a moment I swear the shadows in the room lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward the center of the floor, where the drain sat like a hungry mouth. The substance reached the grate, pooled briefly, then sank, not seeped, sank, as if pulled, welcomed. Then the silence returned, a breathless kind of silence, like something had just fed. I backed away slowly, heart pounding behind my ribs. The walls no longer looked like walls. The cracks between the concrete lines seemed deeper, endless. I could have sworn I heard a clicking sound behind them, soft, faint, like nails tapping rhythmically, or mandibles. I gathered the remaining gear in a daze, my hands trembling. I didn't bother cleaning up. What was the point? Whatever had happened here wasn't confined to spilled chemicals, or broken glass. I had brought something into the world, and it had found its way out. Upstairs, the house felt too quiet. I passed the living room, where Skylar sat, watching the baby monitor, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. She didn't even look at me, just mumbled something about Holly being restless again. I went to the monitor. The screen flickered for half a second, just static, then an image. Holly in her crib, wide awake, facing the corner of the room, staring at something. I watched her eyes track movement. Nothing was there. Then she smiled. Not a baby smile, not a giggle, a slow, knowing curl of the mouth, just like the flame. I turned off the monitor. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The blue flame had changed. It wasn't just a reaction anymore. It had intelligence, a presence. It knew me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had taken something from me, or left something behind. The next morning I went down to the basement again, compelled, drawn. The beaker shards were still there, but the floor was clean, too clean. No stain, no residue. Even the nick on my cheek from the flying glass was gone, as if the room had reset itself, waiting for me to begin again. The flame, when I lit it this time, started instantly, blue, steady, alive, and smiling.
The batch was perfect. That's what I kept telling myself over and over, even as my fingers trembled slightly, wrapping each vial in wax paper. It had taken nearly 6 hours, every movement deliberate, measured, and somehow guided. Jesse was quieter than usual, not twitchy, not high, just quiet, like he was trying not to disturb something we'd summoned into the room. The final product sat on the tray like glass sculptures, fractured sky frozen mid-screen. These weren't crystals, not really. They felt like something else, smooth and sharp all at once, denser than any meth I'd seen or handled. They caught light in impossible ways, refracting it in curves and angles that bent deeper than the surface allowed. At times I swore I saw motion in their reflections, like the light wasn't bouncing off but sinking into them. Jesse picked one up between 2 fingers, turned it over in the fluorescent light. His eyes narrowed. "Do you hear that?" I paused, beaker still in my hand. "Hear what?" He held the crystal to his ear, cocking his head like it was a seashell. "It's like whispering, low. Not words, just breathing maybe." I gave a tight smile. "The RV's engine hums, vibrations in the aluminum. You're just tired." But I'd heard it too. Not just from the crystals, from the moment we'd started cooking. A faint whispering under everything else, barely audible, like wind threading through a dying forest. It didn't speak, but it knew. It was a presence, a pressure. I didn't want to validate it. Not out loud. Not yet. Jesse set the crystal down and walked toward the sink to splash water on his face. I took the chance to study the tray again. The hum wasn't constant. It fluctuated like a heartbeat, and as I leaned closer, I felt a warmth radiating from the largest shard. Not heat, but something that moved beneath the skin, like static dancing along nerve endings. It was subtle but insistent. Then it happened. A moth. It must have gotten in through the tiny roof vent, maybe trapped overnight. It drifted clumsily in the RV's thick air, wings sluggish, its body bloated with stillness. I watched it flutter once, twice, then drop like a stone onto the edge of the counter. Its body twitched once, legs curled beneath it, dead, or close to it. It landed beside the largest crystal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the blue shard pulsed, not visibly, not a light, not a glow. It felt like a pulse, like a shift in the pressure of the room, like everything around it held its breath for half a second, and then the moth moved, its legs uncurled. It stood, slowly, unsteadily, as if waking from some deep wrong sleep, and then it flew, smoothly, too smoothly, like it remembered something. It spiraled up into the fluorescent light fixture, and vanished. Jesse hadn't seen it. He was still at the sink, drying his face, muttering to himself. I didn't say a word, just watched the empty counter and the small, curved imprint in the dust where the moth had died. It was gone, but something of it had stayed. That night, I took one of the crystals home. Just one. A sliver barely the size of a dime. I wrapped it tightly in cloth and buried it deep in my coat pocket. I didn't tell Jessie. Skylar didn't notice when I walked in. She was in the nursery, rocking Holly, humming something soft and off-key, the kind of half-melody you sing without realizing. I paused in the hallway, just listening. The song she was humming, I knew it, or rather, I didn't, but it felt familiar. Oh, a melody I'd never heard, but which pulled something out of the hollow between my ribs, like a memory from someone else's dream. She looked up when I entered the room. "Long day?" she asked. I nodded, avoiding the nursery light. I could feel the crystal heating up in my pocket, not burning, but warming like a heartbeat against my thigh. I stood there, watching her rock the baby, my daughter, tiny, fragile. She stopped humming. "Walt," she said, voice quiet. "Is there something wrong?" I shook my head, but I couldn't stop staring at Holly. She had been asleep, her eyes were closed, but now, they were open, and she wasn't looking at Skylar. She was looking at me, unblinking, too still for an infant. Her lips parted. I didn't hear a sound, but I felt it, a pressure in my head, a sudden tension behind the eyes, like someone brushing fingers against the inside of my skull. I blinked, and she had closed her eyes again. Skylar looked down, rocked her gently, unaware. I said nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the crystal on the desk in my study, wrapped tightly, but still pulsing. Every now and then I swore I heard something from it. Not a whisper exactly, more like a tug, an idea pulling at the edge of my consciousness. At 3:17 a.m., the bulb in the desk lamp popped, a soft, contained crackle. I didn't replace it. I just sat in the dark, listening to the hum. The next morning, Jesse called me. He sounded shaken. "Walt," he said, "I think something's wrong with me." I didn't answer right away. He kept going. "I had a dream again, but this time I wasn't asleep. I was on the couch, and I must have dozed off. And I don't know, man. I saw stuff." "What kind of stuff?" I asked. He hesitated. "A corridor, all white, wet, like it was made of flesh, you know, and there were doors, too many, all of them closed, except one. And," he lowered his voice, like someone might be listening. "There was something behind it, breathing. I didn't open it. I couldn't, but I felt it. It knew I was there. I felt cold sweat bead at the base of my neck." Jesse coughed, and then I woke up, except I didn't feel like I had. I heard his lighter click in the background, a shaky inhale. "Tell me the truth, Walt. What are we making?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know anymore. It wasn't meth. It never had been. Later that day, I returned to the RV alone. The moth was waiting for me, not the same one, I don't think, but it looked like it, sitting in the exact same place it had landed before, on the counter, next to the largest shard of the leftover batch. It didn't move when I approached. Then, as I reached out, it fluttered once, landed on my wrist, stayed there, still, waiting, like it remembered me, like it was part of something bigger now. The crystal hummed, softly, and the moth opened its wings to reveal a second pair beneath, translucent, wet, new. It had changed. So had I. So had everything. It was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. The first dealer I gave it to was a guy named Darnell. He wasn't the brightest, but he knew the game, slinging small bags on the corner, moving quickly, keeping his head down. He'd been on the streets long enough to know what he was doing. At least that's what I thought. When I handed him a vial of the new batch, I didn't expect much. Maybe a quick transaction, maybe a little feedback. But when he came back the next day, eyes wide, pupils blown wide open, I knew something had gone wrong. He was shaking when he walked in. His fingers twitched, and the sweat on his forehead wasn't from heat, it was from fear. His voice was hoarse, and he barely managed to speak. "Walt," he rasped, clutching the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Man, this shit, it's not like anything else. It ain't normal. It's not what I expected." I waited for the usual complaints about the potency, maybe about the taste, but he didn't go there. He looked past me, his gaze darting around the room, scanning the corners like someone was watching him. "What's going on, Darnell?" I asked, my tone softer than I wanted it to be. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Saw it, man. It was watching me, from the walls, and the light, it was too bright. The whole room was alive." He staggered backward, pressing his hands against his forehead, as though trying to stop something from slipping out of his brain. I didn't know what to say. I'd heard enough from addicts. This wasn't new territory, but there was something different in Darnell's eye. He didn't look like a guy coming down from a bad trip. He looked like someone who had seen something. "The hell are you talking about?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain calm. Inside I was already calculating. Maybe the batch was too strong, too potent. That was the only explanation I could stomach. "I saw it, man. The black sun." His voice dropped lower, and he grabbed my arm. "It was too bright, man. It was too fucking bright. I couldn't get away. I couldn't." His words stopped as he staggered back further, hands raised, as if fighting something invisible. Before I could react, he let out a shriek, the kind of scream that rattles bones and makes you feel it in your own chest. He fell to his knees, his face contorted in terror, and in the chaos of the moment, he reached for his face. The sickening sound of tearing flesh. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. In a frenzy, Darnell gouged at his own eyes, tearing at his skin, like he could erase whatever horror he had seen. "The black sun is too bright," he screamed. "Too fucking bright." The blood was pooling beneath him in slow, steady rivers. His breath came in ragged gasps, and as he collapsed to the floor, his hands went limp. I could see the raw, torn skin of his eyes, the sockets empty, but still the screams echoed in the corners of the room. I stared, froze. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place, watching him bleed out. It took me hours before I could do anything, hours to clean up, hours to come to my senses. But by the time I finally closed the door behind me, Darnell was gone. He was out there somewhere, screaming his last breath into the unforgiving night. And somehow I was sure it wasn't just the drugs. It wasn't the meth. It was something else. The next few days blurred together. The lab, the methodical work that kept me sane as I watched the world outside begin to unravel. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the meth. Not that it was just stronger, or faster, or more dangerous, but that it wasn't meth at all. And maybe, just maybe, I had stumbled upon something that should have been left buried. But the buyers kept coming. Jesse told me they wanted more, said they didn't care about the price, said they needed it, and they weren't the only ones. Word spread fast. The streets wanted it. They needed it. I saw the look in Jesse's eyes as he handed me the latest batch. He'd been using it too, a little more than he should have, I noticed. His hands were shaking, his pupils blown wide, but he didn't seem scared. He was chasing something. Something I didn't understand, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop any of them, and that's when the second dealer came in. Carlos, middle-aged, small-time, the kind of guy who knew better than to get too deep into the game. He came in with that same hungry look Darnell had, the same desperate energy. I didn't ask what he had seen, but I knew. I could smell the fear on him, and it wasn't just the meth. I watched him take a hit from the crystal, his face contorting almost immediately, the way his body jerked back, his breath catching, the way his eyes seemed to lose focus. It was like he was trying to scream,
but the words wouldn't come. And then as his fingers twitched uncontrollably, he whispered something low under his breath, in a language that didn't sound human. I tried to ignore it, but it was harder now. Every time I looked at him, I swore I saw something moving in his eyes, something dark, like a storm cloud gathering in the center of his pupils, something that wasn't him. And when I glanced at the counter, at the tiny shard of the crystal under the microscope, it wasn't what I expected. The crystal wasn't still. It was growing, slowly, imperceptibly, but growing. The edges were curling, expanding, and as I leaned in closer, it changed color, faint at first, just a shade darker, then darker still, until it was black. I leaned back, heart hammering in my chest. It didn't just change, it looked back at me. The crystal, pulsing in the light, seemed to shimmer with a new, deeper hue, something ancient, something that recognized me. I forced myself to look away. Carlos had stopped moving. His breath was shallow now, labored. He was staring at me through wide, unblinking eyes, mouth parted. He wasn't speaking in English anymore. He wasn't speaking in any language I knew, and yet the words came with clarity. "The gate is open," he murmured. "The stars are bleeding. Walt, the sun is not ours." I stood up abruptly, backing away from him, my mind reeling. What the hell was happening to these people? What was happening to me? Carlos's hand twitched one last time. His lips curled into a smile too wide, too unnatural, and then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. I couldn't even move to I just watched him crumple to the floor, the same thing I'd seen Darnell do. The crystal, beneath the microscope, pulsed once more, and then it stopped. Everything in the room stopped, except for that quiet whispering under my skin. I didn't sleep that night. I could, because something was watching, and it wasn't just them anymore. It was me. Skylar had been drifting further away, little by little, with each passing day. It wasn't something I wanted to notice at first. You don't want to see the distance growing between you and the people you love, but eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. The way she pulled away when I got too close, the way her eyes would linger on me, like she was searching for something familiar but couldn't find it anymore. I didn't understand it then. I could not when everything else felt like it was coming together perfectly. My formula, the purity of the product, the control I finally had. It felt like I was becoming something more, something better, something capable of achieving what I never could before. But Skylar, she started seeing something else, something I couldn't see. She started saying things I didn't want to hear. "You smell like burning metal," she told me one night as we sat at the kitchen table, her eyes narrowing as she sniffed the air. Her tone was cautious, like she was trying not to alarm me. "Like you're made of rust." I didn't know how to respond. I told myself it was just her imagination, or maybe the lingering chemicals I'd been working with, the solvents and acid. But even as I said the words, I felt a pang of something deeper in my chest, a kind of unease that I couldn't explain. A few days later, she stopped letting me hold Holly. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just her usual overprotectiveness. She said I was too tired, too distracted, that I needed rest. But the way she said it, her voice a little too flat, a little too sharp, made me uneasy. I caught her glancing at me from across the room, her expression unreadable, before quickly turning her gaze back to the baby. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that she was just stressed, overwhelmed, but a quiet part of me wondered if it was something more. I remember the moment it truly hit me. I was sitting in the living room late one night, working on some calculations in my notebook. The blue meth had changed again. It was perfect, impossibly perfect. But as I sat there staring at the precise arrangement of chemicals in my notebook, I heard something from the hallway. Skylar. She wasn't asleep. I could hear the soft shuffle of her feet against the carpet, the faint rustle of her pajamas. I glanced up briefly, but didn't look long enough to see her face. Something about the way she moved felt off though, like she wasn't fully there. Her voice came next, muffled through the walls as she whispered something under her breath, something that sounded like a prayer or a warning. I couldn't make it out, but the sound of it lingered, pulling at the edges of my awareness. It unsettled me, gnawed at me like a string I couldn't tug free from my mind. I closed the notebook and stood up, walking toward the bedroom. When I reached the door, I stopped. Skylar wasn't in bed. She was standing near the crib. Holly was still asleep, but Skylar was still not moving. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, her head tilted forward. She stood so rigidly that for a moment I thought she was just another shadow in the corner. "Skylar," I called, my voice gentle but with an edge of concern. She didn't respond. She didn't even flinch when I said her name again. I took a step closer, the air around me suddenly thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. Something in me felt a flicker of panic, a spark of unease that began to grow with every passing second. I reached out, touched her arm. "Skylar," my voice was louder now, more insistent. She jerked, as if snapped out of a trance, and I swear her eyes snapped to mine, wide, unblinking, but not the way they usually were. They were too still, too empty. There was something in her gaze, something dark, something not quite. She blinked once, then twice, like she was trying to clear away a fog. "Walt," her voice was soft, a little too soft. It was hollow, like she was speaking through something thick and oppressive. She turned back toward the crib, her expression unreadable. "Something's wrong with you." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt a cold shiver slip down my spine. I wanted to ask her what she meant, what she saw, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, constricted. "Skylar, what are you talking about?" She turned slowly to face me, her face pale, her lips thin, almost trembling. Her breath was shallow. "You don't look right," she said, her eyes flickering briefly to the baby before locking onto me again. "Your shadow, it doesn't match. It's lagging behind you, Walt. It's too thick, too long." I didn't understand what she meant, but I could feel the weight of her words, settling in the room with a suffocating presence. And then she said something that truly froze me. "I woke up last night, Walt." My pulse quickened, my hands suddenly clammy. She shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were standing over Holly's crib, staring at her. Your eyes were open, but you weren't blinking, not even once." My chest tightened, my breath felt shallow, and I couldn't move for a moment. The room spun, but my eyes remained fixed on her face, on her wide, terrified eyes. I felt like I was suffocating, like something deep inside me was being torn apart from the inside out. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, I looked toward Holly's crib. The baby slept soundly, innocent, unaware, but my gaze lingered on the empty space beside her crib, the space where Skylar had found me standing in the dark. I don't remember walking into the room that night. I don't remember standing there, eyes wide open, not blinking, not moving. I don't even remember the feeling of being in the room, of seeing Skylar's face. It was like I had been somewhere else, somewhere not quite myself, and yet somehow I felt like it was the first time I had ever truly seen her. I didn't sleep that night. I could. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, her expression, her fear, and underneath it all, I heard the whispering, faint, at first, like a distant hum, but the more I thought about it, the more it grew louder, closer, clearer. There was something inside me now, something that had been waiting for me to notice, and somehow I think it was waiting for Skylar too. The desert always felt like it was waiting for us, endless stretches of sand and heat, the only company the distant hum of wind through cracked earth, and the sound of our boots shifting with every step. The RV had become a kind of home, our sanctuary in the middle of nowhere, tucked away from prying eyes. There was no one for miles, and that was how we liked it. There was a peace in that isolation, a silence so deep you could almost hear your thoughts fall into it, disappear without a trace. We parked it in the same spot every time, a perfect little patch of sand, nestled between two jagged outcrops of rock, just far enough from the highway that no one would find us unless they were looking for trouble. The RV became more than just a vehicle to us. It was a refuge, a cocoon, where we could operate freely without concern. I never questioned it, not until that day we had been gone for a few hours, just long enough to stretch our legs, grab supplies and maybe take a breather. But when we came back, the RV was gone. At first, I thought I had misremembered where we parked it. Maybe we had left it further down the road, just out of sight. So I told Jesse to check the perimeter while I scanned the horizon, my eyes tracing the desolate landscape, hoping for a glimpse of the familiar silhouette. But there was nothing, just dust and silence. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the wasteland, but no RV. I felt the weight of it sink into my chest, a heaviness, as if something had changed in the air. I turned around slowly to find Jesse already standing behind me, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Walt, you see this?" he whispered, voice barely above a breath. I followed his gaze. There just ahead, far too far for us to have moved it, sat the RV, running idle, engine humming quietly like it had never stopped. The door was wide open, as though someone had left in a hurry, and the stove was still hot, faint wisps of smoke curling up into the dry air. It was a sickening, impossible thing to witness. I was already moving before I could think it through, my feet dragging me forward, the instinct to check taking over. Jesse hesitated, staying a few paces behind, his boots crunching on the gravel as he shuffled nervously toward me. I could hear the faint scrape of the metal door against the frame. As I pulled it open, the air inside was stale, heavy, almost suffocating in its stillness, but there was no sign of anyone, no fresh footprints, no signs of struggle, no bags or gear left behind, just the stove and the seat where we sat every time, staring out the windows into nothingness. I stepped inside, my breath hitched. It felt wrong. The smell, stale meth vapors mixed with something metallic and charred, clung to the air, thickening everything around me. "Jesse, check the back," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure what I expected him to find. He nodded, and I heard him move off toward the rear of the RV, the sounds of his footsteps muted by the oppressive silence. I walked to the front, toward the steering wheel. My hand hovered over the ignition, but I didn't turn it. I didn't want to. Something in me told me that the engine, still running, didn't need to be turned off. It wasn't for me to decide. It was then I saw it. The condensation on the window smeared and fogged as if it had been drawn there in haste. At first, it looked like a few random scratches, the patterns too irregular to mean anything. But as I leaned closer, the letters became clearer, the shapes forming words in the haze. "Keep cooking. We're almost here." My breath caught in my throat, and I staggered back, a chill spreading from the base of my spine to the back of my neck. I wiped at the fog, rubbing my palm against the glass, but it didn't fade. The words were burned into the condensation, the edges sharp and final as if they were always meant to be there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something had been in the RV. Someone had been here. They had left this message. The chill in the air had deepened, turning from unsettling to oppressive, like something dark was creeping around the edges of my mind, pushing in. "Walt, man, this isn't good." Jesse's voice came from behind me, trembling. "This isn't. Something's not right." I turned to see him standing in the doorway of the small bathroom, his face twisted in horror. "Walt, I felt it." I could barely hear him over the sound of my own pulse in my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice thick, like I was wading through a dream or a nightmare. It didn't matter anymore. "I don't know." Jesse shook his head frantically. "When I was in the back, I could feel it, like something was watching me, like something wanted me to move, but I didn't. I swear I didn't. I couldn't." I stared at him for a moment, a sinking feeling pooling in my stomach. I knew exactly what he meant. It was the same pressure I had felt when I first walked into the RV, the same unsettling presence that now lingered, thick in the air. I stood frozen for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, suffocating me. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the desert in sharp gusts, but the air in the RV was dead. The heat clung to the inside of the walls like something hungry, like it had been waiting for us to return. "Walt," Jesse whispered, breaking through my thoughts, his eyes wide with fear. "What if it's them? What if we're not alone anymore?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. The words on the window, "Keep cooking. We're almost here," echoed in my mind, reverberating through the air like the hum of the RV's engine. It was too much, too impossible. I stepped back out of the RV, away from the suffocating atmosphere inside. My legs felt weak beneath me, like the ground itself had shifted while I was inside. I didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do, but all I could think of was getting out of there, getting away from the feeling of something closing in on me. I heard Jesse behind me, but I didn't look back. We walked, or rather stumbled, in silence back toward the road, toward the truck. The words on the window stayed with me, etched into my mind, haunting my every step. We never spoke of it again, but when I lay awake that night, the words returned, and the next day they were still there, floating in the back of my mind, like a warning I couldn't outrun. Something was waiting for us, waiting for me to finish what I started, and I knew then, deep in my gut, that there was no escaping it, no turning back. We were already part of it, and it wasn't done with us yet.
Gus Fring wasn't the type of man you would call surprised. In all the time I had spent with him, I had never once seen him lose his composure. He had a reputation for being cool under pressure, for being a meticulous planner who calculated every move. I assumed it was part of his carefully cultivated mask. It had to be. A man who built a billion-dollar drug empire wouldn't show weakness, not in front of anyone. But when I handed him the vial, he didn't ask a single question. Not one. His eyes didn't flicker. His jaw didn't tighten. He didn't show any hint of confusion. No sign of the usual business curiosity I had come to expect from him. Instead, he just looked at the vial for a long moment, his hands steady as he took it from me. For a brief second, I thought he might drop it. He didn't, but his fingers tightened around the glass, just slightly. A fraction of a second that stretched out like a wire pulled too taut. Then he smiled. It wasn't the warm, restrained smile he gave to customers or employees. This one was wider, too wide. His lips stretched across his face as if to show his teeth. His eyes narrowed, but his pupils stayed impossibly still. "Very impressive," he said, his voice a smooth monotone, but his smile didn't fade. It only grew wider. I watched him, my pulse quickening, wondering what he was thinking. What was going on behind those dark eyes? He wasn't the type to leave things unsaid. So why wasn't he asking questions? Why wasn't he demanding more details? Every time I had handed him something new before, he had asked, prodded, analyzed. He never just took something without wanting to know every last detail. But this time, he simply nodded, as though he had seen all this before. Seen it coming. "Walt," he said, still smiling, but there was something else in his voice now, a kind of satisfaction. "I've been waiting for someone like you." The words sank into the pit of my stomach. He didn't sound impressed. He sounded pleased. But what did he mean? Someone like me? "You've been waiting for me," I repeated, unable to mask the weariness in my tone. "For what?" Gus didn't answer immediately. He held the vial to the light, inspecting it from all angles as if looking for something only he could see. He wasn't just looking at the crystal blue meth. It was more like he was studying the process. He glanced up at me, and for the first time I saw something shift in his gaze, something dark, something almost otherworldly. "Yes," he said finally, his voice even. "For the process." It was a cryptic answer, a statement that only deepened the mystery. I didn't ask any more questions. I couldn't. The air in the room had thickened, closing in on me. It wasn't just the humidity in the room, or the faint smell of old burned coffee. There was something else in the air, something heavy. It felt like a storm was gathering, ready to break. Gus set the vial down gently on the table, his hands smooth, deliberate. His fingers hovered above it, brushing the glass as if feeling its weight, its presence. And then, without looking away from the vial, he slowly reached for the lid. I stiffened. The whole thing felt wrong. The way he moved, the way he held himself. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. It was almost as though he was savoring the moment, and yet my mind screamed at me to stop him, to prevent it. But I didn't move. The moment his fingers touched the vial, it happened. His pupils dilated, but it wasn't a normal dilation. They didn't swell into circles as if reacting to the light. No, his pupils shifted into shapes I couldn't comprehend at first. I blinked, rubbed my eyes in disbelief, but when I looked again it was unmistakable. His pupils had shifted into hexagon. They weren't round anymore. They weren't even oval. They were angular, sharp, perfect geometric shapes like patterns burned into the retina. It wasn't just his eyes changing. It felt like something in the air had shifted, like the world had folded at that moment, and everything around me, the room, the atmosphere, even the light itself, felt like it was becoming something else. The temperature dropped. The air felt thicker, denser, like the walls themselves were closing in. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through my chest. I looked at Gus, his face still unchanged, though his smile remained unnervingly wide, unblinking as if time had frozen around him. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel it. The sensation was crawling through me, slithering beneath my skin, up my spine, pushing against the walls of my mind. It was like being watched by something much older than myself, something that had existed long before humanity even had a name, something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me. Walt, Gus said, his voice now a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Do you feel it? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I could barely breathe. It was as though the very air in the room had thickened to the point where it was suffocating me. My heart was pounding, my vision swimming. The world felt like it was tilting, sliding sideways, and through it all Gus's face remained unmoving, his pupils still locked on mine, hexagonal and sharp. His smile was now something more, something knowing. I stepped back involuntarily, stumbling toward the door. The back of my neck prickled, sweat beaded on my forehead, and as I turned to leave, the words Gus had said echoed in my mind. The process. I wasn't sure what he meant, but in that moment I felt the weight of it, the weight of everything. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. What we were doing wasn't just about chemistry anymore. It wasn't just about making money or power. There was something else behind it all, something bigger, darker. Gus had been waiting, waiting for me to come to this point, waiting for the door to open, and now that it had, I felt something stir in the shadows, something otherworldly, a force that wasn't bound by time, by logic, or by anything I could understand. I didn't turn back to look at him as I walked out, but I felt his eyes on me. I could feel the weight of his gaze following me, waiting. At first I thought it was just the meth. Jesse had always been a bit off. Even before the blue, he had a way of staring off into space, his thoughts always somewhere else. But after we started cooking the new batch, it became worse. The subtle shifts in his behavior became more pronounced, more erratic, less human. It started small. A few things he said, strange observations. He'd comment about the air feeling thick, like there was something in it, something he couldn't describe but could feel. He'd pause in the middle of a sentence, eyes drifting into the distance, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I told myself it was just the drugs. The blue meth was different, sure, but no drug could do this, could have this effect on him, could make him see and yet, the more I told myself that, the more I began to wonder. Walt, Jesse said to me one night, his voice strangely hollow, like the words were falling from far away. We were sitting in the RV after the day's work, the usual hum of the engine, and the crackling silence between us. I can see through the walls now. I can see everything. You don't get it. I didn't know what he meant. My brow furrowed, and I glanced up from my work, but I didn't say anything. I waited for him to explain. Like the walls, he continued, eyes glazed over, unfocused. They don't hide anything anymore. It's like I can just see through them, like they're made of glass. I can see what's behind them, what's inside, what's hiding. His voice was strange. The words felt like they were spilling from his mouth without thought, without structure, without rhythm. I laughed uneasily, a nervous chuckle. Jesse, it's just the meth, man. You're hearing things. But his eyes didn't shift. They were too wide, too intense. I can hear combo too. That stopped me. What? He didn't look at me, didn't seem to acknowledge my surprise. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, almost like he was listening for something. I hear him, Walt. I hear combo. He's talking to me. He says I have to keep going, keep cooking. He says the next batch is gonna be the one. His voice grew quieter, almost a whisper,
as though speaking louder would break whatever thread held him together. I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to process the words. The air inside the RV suddenly felt colder. He was sweating now, his shirt damp, his hands shaking as he gripped the table. "I don't know what's happening to me," he muttered. I don't sleep anymore. I can't. I keep hearing him. I keep hearing the voices, and when I close my eyes, it's like they come through." He leaned back, eyes darkening, the lids fluttering as though they were too heavy to hold open. I shook my head, trying to push through the dread creeping over me. "Jesse, you've got to stop. You've got to take a break from this. I don't blink either," he interrupted, his voice distant and cold. "What?" "I don't blink," he repeated, staring at me as if his words made perfect sense. "I haven't blinked in, I don't even know how long. It's like my eyes don't need it. I just see everything. It's all clear." His eyes never wavered from mine. They were wide, unblinking, like black pools that had swallowed everything around him. I wanted to look away, but something in me needed to see it, to understand it. "Jesse, you have to." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was lost in his thoughts, murmuring to himself, his hands now twitching, like they were trying to grasp something invisible. I didn't know what to say. The meth wasn't supposed to do this, but this wasn't just the meth. Something had changed. Something inside him had shifted. I could see it in his eyes. When I saw him again the next day, I knew something had broken. He was sitting at the table, hunched over a piece of paper, furiously sketching something. His breath was ragged, uneven. He didn't even look up when I entered the RV. His eyes stayed fixed on the paper. "Jesse?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. He didn't respond. I walked closer, my heart pounding, and leaned over his shoulder to look at what he was drawing. It was an image of the RV, but it was wrong. The RV was floating, hovering above the desert, as if it had risen from the ground. The desert beneath it was drawn in unnaturally sharp detail, the lines jagged, like they were trying to break free from the paper. Around the RV, there were figures, tall, thin, and impossibly still. Their faces weren't there. They were just empty spaces, dark voids, where their eyes should have been. No faces, no features, just nothing. I recoiled. The air in the RV suddenly felt too tight, too thick. My chest tightened as I looked at the drawing, my mind screaming that this wasn't right. "Jesse, what is this?" My voice cracked as I tried to keep the panic out of it. He finally looked up at me. His face was pale, his lips trembling slightly, his eyes still wide, unblinking. "They're here, Walt," he whispered, voice hoarse. "They've always been here. They're waiting for us." I could hear the tremor in his voice, the way his breath came faster, more shallow. His pupils were still dilated, too large for the dim light of the RV, but they were different now. Not just wide, they were distorted, long, oval-shaped, stretched in ways that didn't belong in the world. It was like his eyes had become liquid, like they were melting into something else. I felt a cold sweat form on my back. My hands shook. I couldn't take my eyes off the drawing. The figures, those faceless shapes, seemed to be moving, like they were crawling out from the page, closing in. "Jesse," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You need to get out of here. You need to sleep." But he didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed the paper and tore it from the table, holding it close to his chest, like it was a precious secret. "It's not about sleep, Walt. It's about that." I backed away, unsure of what to do, what to say. My mind screamed at me to do something, but all I could do was watch as Jesse's descent continued. He was slipping farther and farther into something else, something I couldn't understand. I didn't know how much longer I could keep him from falling completely, but I knew this much. Whatever had started with the meth, it was only the beginning. It wasn't just in Jesse. It wasn't just in me. It was in everything. And soon, it was going to break free. I don't know why I stayed that night. It wasn't part of the plan. There was no reason to really. The lab was quiet. The night stretched on in its usual monotony. Yet, as I stood there, leaning over the counter, measuring the chemicals for another batch of blue, I felt it. A subtle pull, an unease that I couldn't shake. I had been here countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker somehow, heavier, like the very walls of the lab were pressing in on me. I had always prided myself on my ability to keep my focus, to maintain the discipline needed to see this thing through. But tonight, my mind kept wandering, and the weight of the silence was unbearable. Every little noise felt amplified. My breathing, The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint squeak of the overhead light. It was when the thump came that I froze. It wasn't loud, not at first. A dull, muffled noise, like something heavy had fallen against the inside of the storage cabinet. The noise was out of place, cutting through the air with a clarity that made my spine stiffen. It wasn't like the usual settling sounds of the lab, or the soft creaks of the building settling. This was something else. I stood motionless for a moment. Listen. The noise didn't repeat, but the stillness that followed was even more suffocating than before. I pushed back from the counter, my chair scraping against the floor, too loud in the empty room. I walked toward the storage cabinet at the back of the lab, the thump still echoing in my mind. The cabinet was tucked away in the corner, hidden behind a stack of old crates. I had never paid much attention to it. It wasn't anything special, just a storage space for equipment I rarely used. But tonight, for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about. I reached for the handle, cold metal beneath my fingers, and pulled the door open. Empty, just the usual clutter, old glassware, forgotten beakers, half-empty bags of supplies. Nothing had fallen. The cabinet was as it always was, but as I stood there scanning the shelves, something caught my eye. On the inside of the metal door, something was scratched into the surface, deep lines. The metal was scored, gouged in spiraling patterns that looked like they had been made by something sharp, relentless. The scratches were too deep, too intricate to be accidental. They were deliberate. They had a purpose. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. The spiral started at the center of the door, and spiraled outward, like something had been trying to escape to claw its way out, leaving behind these jagged markings as it moved. I stepped back, a shiver crawling up my spine. The longer I stared at the scratches, the more they seemed to move, like they were shifting, writhing just beneath the surface of the metal. I pulled my gaze away. My hands were shaking now, the unease turning into a deep sense of dread. I slammed the door shut, as if trying to force the uneasiness out of the room, as though the act of closing the cabinet would make everything right again. But the moment the door clicked into place, I felt it. The air around me grew cold, unnaturally cold. It wasn't the temperature in the lab. No, it was a sudden bone-deep chill that crept into my bones. I turned quickly, half expecting to see something in the corner, in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the same empty lab. Then a whisper. It was barely audible at first, but it sliced through the silence like a knife. A soft, breathy murmur that seemed to come from the very walls of the room. "We're learning your shape." I froze. It wasn't a voice I recognized, not a whisper from outside or from anyone I knew. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was more like a presence, speaking directly into my mind. My heart skipped a beat, and the world around me seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. I turned around, my eyes scanning every corner of the room. Nothing except the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the distant sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. But I could feel it. It was there, watching, waiting. I took a step back, my breath quickening, my pulse racing. I reached out to steady myself against the counter, the cool metal grounding me as I tried to push the terror back. I told myself it was just my mind, just stress, overwork, too much time spent in the lab. But the longer I stood there, the more the feeling of something watching, something waiting grew. The whispering faded, but the sense of presence didn't. I was being pulled in, closer to something I couldn't understand. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of that room. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Then, another noise, a sound from the corner of the lab, the scraping of metal on metal. It was faint, like something small was dragging itself across the floor. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, louder now, scraping, skittering. I turned sharply, my eyes searching the darkness in the far corner of the room. There was nothing there, just shadows, just the silence of the lab. But then, I saw it. In the corner, near the pipes where the shadows gathered, I saw something moving, small at first, then larger, as it scuttled toward the wall. My heart skipped a beat, and I found myself rooted to the spot, too terrified to move. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't a rodent, it wasn't anything I could place. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like it was trying to figure out how to use its limbs, how to be. The closer it came, the more it looked like a shadow trying to form itself, shifting, breaking apart, then reassembling itself in new, terrifying shape. I forced myself to take a step back, but my legs felt heavy, weighed down by the dread that clung to the air. It knew I was watching. I could feel it. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow-like thing vanished, sinking back into the darkness. My head was spinning, my mind racing to find an explanation. My heart hammered against my ribcage, and I felt as if I was suffocating. Every part of me screamed to get out, to run, but I couldn't move. Something was in that lab with me, something that didn't belong. I reached for the light switch, flipping it on, bathing the room in a harsh fluorescent glow. The light flickered for a moment before steadying, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. I looked around the room, every inch of it convinced that I'd see something standing there, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty, sterile lab. The sense of being watched didn't fade. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my skin, creeping into my I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the whispers, they were still there, in the back of my mind, faint, lingering. "We're learning your shape." I rushed out of the lab, slamming the door behind me. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the air felt lighter, like I could breathe again. But even as I stood there trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still inside the lab, watching, waiting. The world outside felt like it had shifted. The rules were no longer the same, and I knew, deep down, that it would only be a matter of time before whatever was learning my shape would come for me. The truth is, I didn't understand what the crystal was at first. I thought it was just another drug, another way to make money. But as I watched its effects on the people who used it, I began to realize something I couldn't ignore. The crystal wasn't just a chemical, it was something more, something that didn't just alter minds or distort reality. It fractured it, and it did the same to the people who consumed it. The first time I saw it happen, I didn't believe it. I thought it was some kind of accident, a bizarre, freakish overdose. But the second time I knew, I felt it. The terror crept through me, slowly, like a shadow spreading across my thoughts, until it consumed everything. The crystal was no longer just a product. It was something else entirely. It was a doorway, a threshold into something beyond. I remember the first death. His name was Kevin, just another junkie, one of Jesse's guys. He had been taking the blue for a while, using it in smaller doses, but this time he went too far. Jesse warned him, tried to stop him, but Kevin insisted. He wanted to see more. He wanted to feel the full effect. He smoked the crystal like it was just another hit, but it wasn't just another hit. His body didn't respond the way it should have. He didn't get high, not like before. At first it looked like he was having a seizure. His muscles tightened, his back arched, and he let out a strange, guttural scream, like something primal and broken. Jesse and I rushed to him, trying to hold him still, trying to stop him from thrashing, but it was already too late. His skin started to burn. I could smell it like flesh on fire, but the worst part was watching it peel away, as though it were melting. The surface of his skin began to slough off, like it was dissolving into the air, and as it did, something else began to emerge. His eyes rolled back in his head, but they didn't stay still. They started shifting, moving from side to side, like they were searching for something just out of reach. And then, his body began to unravel. It wasn't just his skin, it was his form. His flesh disintegrated, slowly at first, like sand slipping through the cracks in his bones, and then faster, until his entire body seemed to come apart. His atoms didn't just break apart, they exploded, dispersing, vaporizing into the air with a noise like crackling fire. I heard a faint laugh as it happened, a deep, throaty laugh that didn't sound like anything human. That was when I knew the crystal wasn't just a drug, it was a gate, and Kevin had opened it. We didn't know what to do. We were standing in the middle of the mess that had once been a person, watching as his body became nothing more than particles disintegrating into the air. A few seconds later, nothing was left, nothing, except the smell of burnt flesh, and the faintest sickening laughter, still echoing in the back of my mind. "Walt," Jesse whispered, his voice trembling. "What the fuck was that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. The crystal, the blue substance, had changed him, but I didn't understand how or why. "Jesse," I said, my voice low, barely above a whisper, "what did we just see?" I don't know, Jesse said, looking around the room, as if the walls might give him some kind of answer, but that wasn't normal. I don't think that was just the drug. That wasn't human. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how right he was. That wasn't just a drug-induced breakdown. It was something far worse. Kevin had disappeared, not in the way people die from overdoses, but like he'd been reduced, like his very essence had been pulled apart. It was then that I realized what the crystal was really doing. It wasn't just altering perception, distorting reality. It was tearing into the fabric of existence itself, not just the physical body, but the mind, the soul. Whatever Kevin had seen on the other side of that door, it had driven him to the edge of human experience, and then beyond. It was like he'd reached into something that was never meant to be touched, something ungraspable, and now Jesse and I were holding that same power in our hands. The next morning, we found his shoes. I don't know why we thought to look, but there they were, sitting in the corner of the room, just beside the pile of clothing that had been left behind. Kevin's shoes, sturdy, worn-out boots, sitting neatly side by side, like they had been placed there. But when we picked them up, there was something inside. It wasn't just his clothes, left behind, like everything else had been. No, there were teeth, hundreds of them. The shoes were filled with teeth. Some were large, some small, some jagged, others perfectly smooth, but none of them were Kevin's. There was no way they could have been. Kevin's teeth had long since dissolved, melted away with the rest of him. These teeth were new. They were too clean, too perfect. I stared at them, unable to move, my stomach turning over in on itself. Jesse was already backing away. What the hell, Walt? What is this? I couldn't answer. I didn't have the words. I didn't understand. The teeth felt like a message, something left behind, a reminder, but I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't connect the dots. All I knew was that something else had come through the gate, something that wasn't Kevin anymore. It had mimicked him, taken pieces of him, and now it was leaving those pieces behind, as if it had learned to shape itself from the fragments. I couldn't look at the teeth anymore, so I closed the shoes, locked them away in the back of the RV, but the feeling didn't leave me. It never. The crystal, the gate, was still out there, still working, pulling things from the other side, things that weren't human, things that had never been human, and I knew deep down that it wasn't finished yet.
The first time the formula changed, I thought it was a mistake, a slip of the mind. I had been working with it for months, and up until that point, everything had followed the same pattern. Measurements, steps, precise, perfect, but then it shifted. One line, just one. At first, a new chemical equation appeared, hidden beneath the old. It wasn't anything I'd written, and it wasn't anything that had been there before. The symbols rearranged themselves like they were alive, like they were shifting to something else, something I couldn't comprehend. I didn't question it. I followed it. I always did. Something in my gut told me that if I ignored it, I wouldn't be able to go back. I couldn't unsee it. So I did what I had been trained to do. I read the symbols. I calculated the new reactions. It wasn't just chemistry anymore. It was something else entirely. I was part of it now. It felt like a calling. The formula became a map, a pattern I could only decipher through my intuition, through my hands moving automatically, in sync with the pulse of the crystal, the energy that was inside me inside the lab. It was like I wasn't the one controlling the process anymore, like I had tuned into something far older than myself. The burner was the first thing that showed me I wasn't alone. I was standing over the counter, concentrating on the latest sequence of symbols when the flame flared to life. The match was still in my hand, but the burner had already ignited on its own. I froze, staring at the flame, watching as it danced unnaturally in the still air. The light flickered and twisted in impossible ways, bending inward, contracting and expanding like it was breathing. The blue flame. It had always been strange, but now it felt different. It hummed with energy like it was alive. It didn't just burn, it fed, and it watched. I heard a noise, a soft click behind me. My hands twitched, pulling me away from the flame for a moment. But then my attention was back. Too fast, too focused. The flame shifted again. Sharper now, colder. It was as if something in the room had changed the moment it lit. I couldn't look away. My hands moved without my command. I reached for the next chemical in the sequence, my fingers trembling, but steady. It was as if my body knew exactly what to do, like it had memorized every move long before I had even thought of it. The ingredients fell into place with perfect precision, but as I added each new element, the atmosphere in the lab thickened. It wasn't just the usual chemical reactions I had seen before. There was something else happening. The air felt dense, thick with anticipation. I could feel it. Something was inside me. The blue crystal, the flame, the formula. It was all feeding into me, pulling me into itself. My breath quickened, the heat of the lab mixing with the sweat on my skin. But the burn, the heat, didn't feel like the usual flames. It was colder than that. It wasn't the heat of the reaction. It was something else. The cold of a distant place. The cold of something ancient. I wasn't just cooking anymore. I was channeling something I didn't understand. The light flickered again. A voice echoed in my mind. Not a voice I could hear with my ears, but a presence, a whisper that seeped into my thoughts like smoke through a crack in the wall. It's time. I didn't question it. I followed. My hands moved of their own accord, and I watched, helpless, as I poured the next ingredient into the beaker. The liquid reacted violently, swirling and bubbling, the color shifting. It wasn't blue anymore. It wasn't anything I recognized. It was something else, something that felt wrong. I felt something inside me break. The formula. It was different now. It had crossed into a new plane, a new space. It wasn't just a chemical process anymore. It was a ritual, a doorway. The moment the liquid touched the flame, I heard it, a low, deep hum, like the earth had exhaled. The room vibrated and I felt the walls tremble. I stepped back, but the door wouldn't open. The window wouldn't let me out. The air was too thick now, and something inside me urged me to stay, to continue, to finish it. I wasn't alone anymore. There was something else in the room with me, pulling me forward, holding me in place. I didn't want to turn around, but I knew something was behind me, watching, waiting. I don't know how long it was before I felt the pressure in my chest. The air was too thick to breathe, too tight to think. It was as though the walls were closing in on me, folding inward, and I was the center of it. I felt small, insignificant. I wasn't the one controlling this anymore. The formula had its own life, its own purpose, and now it was shaping me. I don't know how I moved. I don't know when the burner turned itself on. I don't know when I stopped being me. I was part of it. I was the process. I heard a soft click, the sound of a switch, the hum of something turning on. The flame on the burner flared again, but this time it wasn't blue. It was black. It consumed the light, ate the air around it, and for a moment, I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. My hands moved again. And I wasn't the one guiding them. I wasn't the one moving my body. I didn't have to think. I didn't have to decide. I followed. I poured the liquid into a new beaker. The liquid twisted. It changed. It wasn't blue anymore. It wasn't even liquid anymore. It was something else. It was alive. I felt the cold rush through me. I felt it spread through my veins, creeping down my spine, as if it were inside me. And then I heard it again. A whisper, low, quiet, but unmistakable. We're ready. I couldn't move. I couldn't stop. My hands hovered over the final vial, the last step in the ritual. I wasn't alone. I could feel them behind me, beside me, within me. The air was thick with their presence. I reached for the vial, but I couldn't stop. The moment my hands gripped it, the flame flared once more, this time brighter than ever. It consumed the room, filled every corner, every inch of the lab. And I heard the familiar hum, but this time it was different. The hum wasn't just the sound of a reaction, it was alive. I placed the vial down, and then, everything stopped. The air was still, the hum was gone, the walls felt solid again, no longer moving. My hands trembled, my heart pounded in my chest. but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. I was still part of it. The ritual was complete, and I knew it, but something had changed. The crystal wasn't a drug. It wasn't just a chemical. It had opened something inside me, something that wasn't human. It had pulled me through, and now it was inside me. It wasn't over. The first time I stopped calling myself Walter, I thought it was just a phase, a fleeting thought, a moment of rebellion. I had been through so much by that point, sinking deeper into the chemicals, deeper into the process, that I thought calling myself Heisenberg would make it easier to separate the man I was from the thing I was becoming. But over time, that name, that title became something more than a mask. It became a vessel, a shell for the entity that had taken root inside of me. I tried to resist. I really did. I wanted to hold on to Walter, the man I once was, the teacher, the father, but every time I looked in the mirror, I saw less of him and more of it. The man who looked back at me wasn't the man who had started all this. The face wasn't the same. The eyes weren't the same. It wasn't the blue meth that changed me. It was the process, the formula, the ritual. And when I looked into the mirror, I no longer recognized myself. I never planned for any of this to happen, but somewhere along the way, I stopped questioning the changes. I stopped fearing them, because, as I fell deeper into the world of chemicals, into the ritual of cooking, I realized something. The entity that was taking shape inside me had always been there. All I had done was give it a name, Heisenberg, and a place to manifest. At first, it was subtle, small things, like the way I looked at people differently. It was like I could see inside of them, not just their faces, but the edges of their souls. It wasn't always a pleasant sensation. I could feel their desires, their fears, their weaknesses. They were raw to me. I had no empathy for them anymore. They were just tools to be used. Everything was calculated. Everything was for a reason. But it wasn't enough. No matter how much I buried Walter, he kept resurfacing. He kept nagging at the back of my mind. I had to drown him out. I had to silence the part of me that felt human. And I did. Over time I did. Then, one night, I came home late, after a particularly successful batch. The money was piling up. The empire was expanding. The formula was more perfect than ever. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the air. The house was too quiet, too still. Skylar had been distant for weeks, and tonight she hadn't even waited up for me. I thought she was asleep when I walked in, but when I stepped into the bedroom, I froze. The mirror on the wall was reflecting something that wasn't me. For a split second, my face flickered. The man in the mirror wasn't Walter. It was him. It was Heisenberg. But that wasn't the worst part. The reflection was wrong. It wasn't just my face. It was the skin itself, the flesh, the bone. Everything I had once recognized as human melted away for just a moment, leaving behind nothing but raw, shimmering blue crystal. I could see it pulsing, beating like a heart, alive with energy I couldn't understand. The reflection wasn't just a shadow of me. It was something else, something that was living, breathing, and hungry. I blinked, and in that instant, it was gone. My face was back, flesh, skin, hair, the man I knew, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The weight of the moment, the realization, crushed me. My stomach churned, my hands were shaking, as I wiped my face, trying to rid myself of the sensation. I didn't want to believe what I had seen. I couldn't, but deep down, I knew Heisenberg was real, and Heisenberg had already taken over. I couldn't escape it, no matter how much I tried to pull myself back, no matter how much I tried to feel human again. The entity was there, inside me. It had shaped me, molded me, until Walter was no more than a distant echo, a faint memory. I wasn't just cooking meth anymore. I wasn't just making money. The process had changed me. It had taken me somewhere I couldn't return from. And it wasn't just in me. It was in everything I touched, everything I made. The formula, the meth, the crystal. I couldn't see it at first, but over time, the changes became impossible to ignore. When I looked at the people around me, Skylar, Jesse, even Gus, I could see them differently. I could see through them. I could see their weaknesses, their fears,
their need. They were no longer just people to me. They were tools, tools for the ritual, tools for the plan. The more I cooked, the more the crystal pulsed, the more I became the process, and the more I felt the entity inside me grow stronger. It was no longer just a reflection in the mirror. It was everywhere. The hum of the crystal, the hiss of the burner, the rhythmic sound of the stirring rod in the pot. It all became one with me. The process, the ritual, the sacrifice. I started to lose time. Hours would slip away, and I wouldn't even notice. My hands would move without me. I'd stare at the burner, mesmerized by the blue flame, and hours later I would wake up, disoriented, unsure of how much time had passed. Skylar didn't notice. She couldn't see the changes happening inside me. She couldn't see what I had become. But Jesse saw it. He saw the change in my eyes. He saw the way I spoke, the way I acted, the way I commanded. At first, he didn't question it, but over time, I saw the fear in his eyes, the way he avoided me, the way he tried to escape. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the people I was using him too. Jesse was no longer a partner. He was a tool, a piece of the process. I had made him that way, and I didn't need him anymore. I didn't need anyone. I had become Heisenberg, and Heisenberg was becoming something more than just a name, more than just a title. He was a force. And as I stood in front of that mirror, staring at the flicker of blue crystal, I knew that I had crossed a line I couldn't return from. The ritual was complete. I was no longer just a man. I was something else, something alive. The mirror shimmered again, and for just a moment, I saw myself. But this time, there was no flesh, no skin, just the blue crystal pulsing, alive. And as I stared at my reflection, I felt a strange compulsion, a need to embrace it, to let it take over, to become what I had always been meant to be. I smiled, and it wasn't my smile, it was his, Heisenberg's. This is it, the final cook. I can't feel my fingers anymore. They're numb, or maybe it's just that my mind is too distant to notice them. The last batch is almost complete. The formula I've followed for months, no, for years now, is nearing its final stage. Everything has been leading to this moment. The RV feels more alive than ever. The walls seem to hum with something I can't understand. A presence, a force that pulls at me, tugs at my skin, pushing me closer and closer to the point of no return. The burner flickers in front of me, its flame twisted and blackened. It's not blue anymore. It's something else, something darker. It has a pulse of its own now. I don't look at the figures outside. They're always there now, standing just beyond the fogged windows, watching, waiting. They've been here for days, no weeks, but tonight, they feel different. They feel closer. I don't know when they arrive. At first, I thought they were just tricks of the light, hallucinations, but then they moved, subtle, almost imperceptible shifts. I hear them sometimes, their whispers swirling through the RV like smoke, but every time I turn to look, they vanish. I can't see their faces, but I know they're waiting. I know they've always been waiting, and I'm the one they've been waiting for. My thoughts are heavy, tangled in a way I can't explain. The crystal has changed me, changed everything. This is no longer about money or power or even the... This is something more, something ancient. It has been calling me, pulling me toward it, urging me to finish, to complete the cycle. But I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid anymore. Jesse is gone. I don't know where he went, but it doesn't matter now. I haven't heard from him in days, but I can feel him somewhere inside me. Still, he was always part of this. He was always meant to be part of it. Skylar is gone too. She left, taking Holly with her. She couldn't stand the silence. The way I had changed, the way I had become something else. I can't blame her for leaving. I wouldn't want to be here either. The baby stopped crying weeks ago. I haven't heard a sound from her in days, but that doesn't matter. She's not important now. The batch is almost complete. The air inside the RV buzzes like bees in my chest. It's as if the very air around me is vibrating with energy, filling my lungs, filling my veins. I can feel it pulsing through my fingertips, in my bones. The crystal, it feels like it's inside me now. embedded in the fabric of who I am. It's the same in every breath I take, every thought I think. It's not just a substance, it's a part of me. I can hear the whispering again, faint, but distinct. The figures outside are still waiting. I know they want me to finish. I can feel their eyes on me. Even though I can't see them, I don't need to see them. I know they're there, and I know what they want. My hands move automatically now. I don't even need to look at the formula. I don't need to measure or mix. The ingredients are already prepared. The process is already in motion. The burner hums. The blue liquid swirls, and I am just the vessel. The gate is open, and I'm the one who opened it. I don't know when I became this thing, this Heisenberg, but I know now. I understand. The blue turns black. It's subtle at first, a shift in the color, a deepening of the hue, like the flame inside me is consuming everything. The light flickers. The air grows colder, denser. My breath comes faster. The blackness in the crystal pulses, twisting in on itself, like something is pushing its way through from the other side. The burner groans. The glassware rattles. I don't understand what's happening. My hands disappear into the black liquid, and I try to pull away, but it's too late. The darkness is pulling me in, pulling me through. It feels like it's reaching for me, pulling me inside. My skin doesn't feel like it's mine anymore. My body doesn't feel like it's mine anymore. I am dissolving, or maybe I'm becoming something else, something that doesn't belong to this world. I try to scream, but the sound is muffled, swallowed by the hum of the ritual. The whispers grow louder, and I feel their cold fingers tracing my spine. They are inside my head now, in my thoughts, in my soul. The figures outside are closer now. I can feel them pressing against the RV surrounding it, surrounding me. They're waiting for me to finish, waiting for me to open the gate all the way to give them what they've been asking for. I'm not afraid, but I'm not sure I'm in control anymore. Something in the air shifts again. The walls of the RV seem to distort, to breathe. The metal groans like it's being pulled apart. My heart races, but it's not mine anymore. It's theirs. I can feel it. The whispers have become a chant, a prayer, a summoning. Keep cooking. We're almost here. I didn't hear it with my ears. It's in my head, a low murmur, a promise. The final step is almost here. The gate is open, and the last part of the ritual is at hand. I think I've known this all along. I feel my hands, but I don't control them. They move faster now. The crystal is pulling me deeper. My skin is no longer mine. My body is no longer mine. I am becoming the process, becoming the ritual itself. I reach for the final vial. The blue liquid swirls inside, and as I lift it, I feel it. The figures outside press closer. They're inside now. I can feel them moving around me, through me, and just as the final ingredient touches the boiling liquid, I feel myself leave. I am no longer water. I am no longer Heisenberg. I am something else. Something older, something that was always waiting. I hope no one finds this recording, but if you do, don't say my name.